The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped out of her rental car. The salty breeze from San Diego Bay carried the distant sound of helicopter rotors and shouted commands from training exercises. She adjusted her crisp Navy uniform and checked her watch. 8:30 sharp. She had arrived exactly on time for what would become one of the most talked-about demonstrations in modern military training history. Sarah had been selected from hundreds of applicants to participate in a groundbreaking cross-training program between the Navy's elite special operations units and emerging defensive tactics specialists. At 28 years old, she held a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was a certified Krav Maga instructor, and had spent 3 years developing innovative close-quarters combat techniques for female service members. Her petite 5'4" frame often surprised people who underestimated what she could do in a fight. The invitation had come through official channels 3 weeks earlier. The Navy SEALs were expanding their training curriculum to include advanced defensive techniques that could be adapted for various body types and strength levels. Sarah's reputation for developing effective methods that relied on leverage, timing, and technique rather than brute force had caught the attention of senior training officials. They wanted her to demonstrate these principles to an assembled group of SEAL candidates and experienced operators. As she walked toward the main training facility, Sarah noticed the unusual level of activity around the compound. More vehicles than normal filled the parking areas, and she could see clusters of personnel moving between buildings with purpose. The base seemed to be preparing for something significant, though she had been told this was a routine training demonstration. Commander James Mitchell met her at the entrance to the Combat Training Center. A 20-year veteran with multiple deployment ribbons on his uniform, Mitchell had the weathered look of someone who had seen action in multiple theaters. His handshake was firm but respectful, and Sarah immediately sensed that he was taking this demonstration seriously. "Lieutenant Chun, welcome to Coronado," Mitchell said as he guided her through the entrance. "I've read your file and watched some footage of your training methods. Impressive work with the leverage-based defensive systems you've developed." Sarah nodded her thanks as they walked through corridors lined with photos of SEAL teams from decades of operations. The walls seemed to radiate tradition and excellence, reminding her that she was stepping into a world where performance meant the difference between life and death for operators in the field. "Sir, I understand this demonstration is part of a broader training initiative," Sarah said as they approached a set of double doors leading to the main training area. "Can you tell me more about what the command hopes to accomplish?" Mitchell paused at the doors and turned to face her directly. "Lieutenant, there's been some debate in certain circles about the effectiveness of technique-based defensive methods when facing opponents with significant size and strength advantages. Some of our people believe that in real-world situations, physical attributes trump technical skill every time." Sarah had heard variations of this argument throughout her career. It was a common misconception that frustrated many martial arts instructors and defensive tactics specialists. The idea that size and strength were the only factors that mattered in a physical confrontation ignored centuries of evidence to the contrary. "I see," Sarah replied carefully. "And today's demonstration is meant to address those concerns." "In part, yes," Mitchell said. "But I should mention that word has gotten around about what we're doing here today. What was originally planned as a small group demonstration has grown considerably. We currently have just over 300 personnel who will be observing." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. She had performed in front of large groups before, but never in an environment where her credibility and the validity of her methods would be under such intense scrutiny. The stakes felt higher than anything she had previously experienced. They entered the main training area, and Sarah's breath caught slightly. The space was enormous, with high ceilings and professional lighting that illuminated every corner. But what struck her most was the sea of faces surrounding the central mat area. Row upon row of Navy SEALs, SEAL candidates, and other special operations personnel filled bleacher-style seating that had been set up specifically for this event. The assembled crowd represented some of the most elite military personnel in the world. These were individuals who had survived Hell Week, completed multiple deployments in hostile environments, and prided themselves on being among the toughest and most capable fighters on the planet. Their collective presence created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny that Sarah could feel pressing down on her. As Mitchell led her toward a preparation area near the demonstration mat, Sarah began to notice details about the crowd that increased her understanding of what she was walking into. The conversations she could overhear carried a skeptical tone. Comments about size differences, questions about real-world applicability, and doubts about whether technical skill could overcome physical advantages drifted across the space. "The plan is straightforward," Mitchell explained as they reached a small staging area. "We'll have you demonstrate your defensive techniques against several volunteers from the group. Nothing too aggressive, but realistic enough to show how your methods work under pressure." Sarah nodded, but something in Mitchell's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Sir, who exactly will I be working with during the demonstration?" Mitchell's expression became slightly uncomfortable. "Well, that's where things have become somewhat more complicated than originally planned. When word spread about today's event, we had numerous volunteers step forward. The enthusiasm has been significant." Before Sarah could ask for clarification, a voice called out from behind them. "Commander Mitchell, we're ready to begin when you give the word." Sarah turned to see a tall, powerfully built man approaching their position. Even by Navy SEAL standards, he was impressive. Standing at least 6 feet 3 inches with broad shoulders and the kind of muscle development that came from years of intensive physical training, he moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to physical dominance. "Lieutenant Shun, this is Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez," Mitchell said. "He's volunteered to be your primary demonstration partner." Rodriguez extended his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Looking forward to working with you, Lieutenant. Should be interesting to see how your techniques hold up against someone with a bit more size and experience." The subtle challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Sarah shook his hand, noting the deliberate firmness of his grip and the way he held eye contact just a beat longer than necessary. She had encountered this type of skepticism many times before, usually from individuals who equated physical size with fighting ability and couldn't imagine how someone smaller might overcome their advantages. "I'm sure it will be educational for everyone involved," Sarah replied evenly, matching his gaze without backing down. As they moved toward the demonstration area, Sarah became aware of the growing energy in the room. The crowd had grown quieter, with hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on her every movement. Conversations died down as personnel shifted forward in their seats, eager to see whether the techniques they were about to witness could live up to the claims that had been made about them. Mitchell stepped onto the mat and called for attention. The room fell completely silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the occasional sound of movement from outside the building. He quickly explained the purpose of the demonstration, emphasizing the Navy's commitment to exploring innovative training methods that could benefit all personnel regardless of their physical attributes. As Sarah stepped onto the mat, she felt the weight of expectation from every direction. This wasn't just about demonstrating techniques. It was about proving that skill, properly applied, could overcome significant physical disadvantages. The reputation of everyone who had contributed to developing these methods was on the line, along with her own credibility as an instructor. Rodriguez took his position across from her, and Sarah could see the confidence radiating from his posture. At nearly 220 pounds of muscle and bone, he outweighed her by more than 80 pounds. His reach advantage was obvious, and his background in military combat training was evident in every aspect of his stance and movement. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation as Mitchell gave final instructions about safety protocols and the scope of what they would be demonstrating. Sarah felt her heartbeat increase, but forced herself to focus on her breathing and mental preparation. She had trained for situations exactly like this one, though never with quite this many witnesses. Commander Mitchell's hand dropped, and the demonstration officially began. Sarah stood in a relaxed but alert posture, her feet shoulder-width apart, hands at her sides but ready to move instantly. She had learned long ago that the key to successful defensive techniques lay not in aggressive posturing, but in remaining calm and responsive to whatever her opponent might attempt. Rodriguez began circling her slowly, his movements deliberate and confident. He was clearly sizing her up, looking for the best angle of approach, and trying to intimidate her with his physical presence. Sarah had seen this behavior countless times before. Larger opponents often relied on psychological pressure as much as physical force, assuming that their size alone would create hesitation or fear in smaller adversaries. The crowd watched in fascination as the two fighters moved around each other. Many of the observers were taking mental notes, studying Sarah's positioning and wondering how she would handle Rodriguez's obvious advantages. The betting conversations that had started earlier in the morning had intensified, with most personnel convinced that size and strength would prove decisive in any real confrontation. "Whenever you're ready, Lieutenant," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "I'll try not to make this too embarrassing for you." The comment drew a few chuckles from the crowd, but Sarah remained focused and composed. She had heard similar remarks throughout her career and had learned to use them as motivation rather than distraction. Opponents who underestimated her abilities often made crucial mistakes that created opportunities for her to demonstrate the effectiveness of proper technique. Rodriguez suddenly stepped forward and reached out to grab Sarah's shoulders, intending to use his strength advantage to control her movement and demonstrate how easily he could overpower her. It was exactly the type of attack that many larger opponents favored, relying on their ability to establish physical dominance through superior size and leverage. What happened next occurred so quickly that many observers initially missed the details of how Sarah countered the attack. As Rodriguez's hands moved toward her shoulders, Sarah stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously raising her right arm in a precise circular motion. Her movement redirected Rodriguez's momentum while creating an opening that allowed her to slip inside his reach. Before Rodriguez could adjust his position or reset his attack, Sarah had already secured a grip on his right wrist with her left hand while her right arm moved around his neck in a smooth, flowing motion. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, transforming Rodriguez from an aggressor into someone who was suddenly off balance and vulnerable. Sarah applied a technique known as a standing rear naked choke, but her execution was so precise and controlled that Rodriguez found himself caught completely off guard. The leverage she created by positioning her body correctly multiplied her effective strength while simultaneously negating his size advantages. Within moments, he was forced to tap out to avoid losing consciousness. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause. What they had just witnessed challenged many of their fundamental assumptions about physical confrontations. Rodriguez was clearly shaken by how quickly and completely he had been controlled. His confidence visibly diminished as he stepped back and tried to process what had happened. "Well done, Lieutenant," Commander Mitchell said, clearly impressed by the demonstration. "That was exactly the kind of technique application we hoped to see. Who else would like to volunteer?" Several hands shot up immediately. The first demonstration had been impressive, but many observers remained convinced that Rodriguez had simply made a mistake or that Sarah had gotten lucky. They wanted to see whether her techniques would prove effective against different approaches and more experienced opponents. Petty Officer Thompson stepped forward next. Shorter than Rodriguez, but even more muscular, Thompson had a reputation as one of the best grapplers in his unit. He approached the challenge with a more serious attitude, having learned from Rodriguez's mistake about underestimating Sarah's abilities. "No disrespect intended, ma'am," Thompson said as he took his position. "But I'd like to see how your techniques work against someone who knows what's coming." Sarah nodded her appreciation for his more respectful approach. "That's exactly the kind of challenge these techniques were designed to handle, Petty Officer. Feel free to use whatever approach you think will be most effective." Thompson began his attack with much more caution than Rodriguez had shown. He kept his movements smaller and more controlled, trying to avoid giving Sarah the kind of opening she had exploited in the first demonstration. His strategy was to use his wrestling background to gradually close distance and establish a clinch where his strength advantages would be most pronounced. Sarah recognized his approach immediately and adjusted her defensive positioning accordingly. Instead of waiting for Thompson to initiate contact, she began moving in subtle patterns that forced him to constantly readjust his position. Her footwork created angles that made it difficult for him to establish the kind of stable platform he needed to apply his wrestling techniques effectively. When Thompson finally committed to an attack, Attempting to shoot in for a takedown that would allow him to use his grappling skills, Sarah was ready. She sprawled backwards while simultaneously securing an overhook on his right arm. The combination of movements placed Thompson in an extremely vulnerable position where his head and neck were exposed. Sarah immediately applied a guillotine choke, using her entire body to create leverage against Thompson's neck and cutting off his blood supply to his brain. Despite his considerable strength and grappling experience, Thompson found himself unable to escape the submission hold. The precise positioning of Sarah's technique meant that his attempts to muscle out of the hold only tightened the choke further. Within seconds, Thompson was forced to tap out as well. The crowd's reaction was noticeably different this time, with more genuine surprise and fewer skeptical comments. Two experienced operators had been submitted quickly and decisively, and it was becoming clear that Sarah's techniques represented something more than lucky applications of basic defensive moves. Anyone else? Mitchell asked, scanning the crowd for additional volunteers. This time, multiple hands shot up simultaneously. The demonstrations had created a buzz of excitement and curiosity that spread throughout the assembled personnel. What had started as skeptical observation was transforming into genuine interest in understanding how Sarah's methods worked and whether they could be learned and applied by others. Chief Petty Officer Williams stepped forward. A 15-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, Williams had the kind of experience and reputation that commanded respect throughout the SEAL community. His approach to the challenge was notably different from the previous volunteers. "Lieutenant, I've been watching your technique, and I think I understand what you're doing," Williams said. "But I'd like to try a different approach if that's acceptable." Sarah gestured for him to continue, curious about what strategy he might employ. "Instead of trying to grapple or grab you, I'm going to attempt to pin you down using my weight and position. No fancy techniques, just basic pressure and control." It was actually a smart strategy, and Sarah recognized immediately that Williams had identified one of the potential weaknesses in defensive techniques that relied on redirecting an opponent's momentum. If someone could establish stable control without overcommitting to an attack, it might be possible to negate the leverage advantages that her methods typically created. Williams approached slowly and deliberately, keeping his center of gravity low and his movements controlled. When he made contact, he attempted to drive Sarah backwards toward the edge of the mat, while maintaining constant pressure that would prevent her from establishing the kind of precise positioning her techniques required. For a moment, it appeared that Williams' strategy might be successful. His experience and tactical thinking were evident as he methodically worked to establish a dominant position. Sarah found herself being pushed backwards, and several observers began to think that they were finally seeing the limitations of technical skill when confronted with intelligent application of size and strength. But Sarah had encountered similar approaches before and had developed specific counters for opponents who attempted to use pressure and position rather than dynamic attacks. As Williams continued to drive forward, she suddenly dropped her level and executed a technique called a sit-out, spinning underneath his extended arms while securing a grip on his ankle. The movement completely reversed their positions, placing Williams off balance while giving Sarah the leverage she needed to apply a heel hook submission. The technique attacked Williams' ankle and knee simultaneously, creating enough pressure to force him to submit almost immediately to avoid serious injury. The crowd's reaction was now one of genuine amazement mixed with professional respect. Three experienced operators, each using different strategies and approaches, had been defeated quickly and decisively by someone who weighed significantly less than any of them. The demonstrations were proving that properly applied technique could overcome substantial physical disadvantages in ways that many of the observers had never previously considered possible. Commander Mitchell stepped forward again, but before he could call for additional volunteers, several personnel spoke up simultaneously requesting the opportunity to test their skills against Sarah's techniques. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed from skeptical observation to eager participation. "I think we're seeing exactly what we hoped to demonstrate today," Mitchell announced to the crowd. "Lieutenant Chin's techniques are clearly effective against a variety of approaches and opponent types. However, I know there are more volunteers, so we'll continue with a few more demonstrations." What followed was a succession of attempts by increasingly experienced and skilled opponents. Staff Sergeant Martinez, a Marine exchange instructor known for his boxing skills, tried to stay at range and use striking techniques. Sarah countered by closing distance and applying a standing kimura that forced him to submit within seconds. Senior Chief Anderson, one of the most respected close-quarters combat instructors on the base, attempted to use his knowledge of military combatives to counter Sarah's techniques. She defeated him using a technique called a standing arm triangle that he had never encountered before and didn't know how to defend against. By the time the 7th volunteer had been defeated, the energy in the room had reached a fever pitch. Personnel who had initially come to watch what they expected to be a routine training demonstration were now witnessing something unprecedented. The constant stream of quick submissions was creating a legend in real time, and everyone present understood they were seeing something they would talk about for years to come. Lieutenant Commander Jackson stepped forward from the crowd. A former college wrestler turned SEAL officer, Jackson carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been beaten in a physical confrontation. At 6 feet 2 inches and 230 pounds of solid muscle, he represented perhaps the most formidable challenge Sarah had faced so far. "Lieutenant Chun," Jackson said with genuine respect in his voice, "I've been watching your technique very carefully, and I'm genuinely impressed. But I'd like to try something a bit different if you're willing." Sarah nodded, curious about what approach he might take. She had noticed Jackson observing intently during the previous demonstrations, clearly studying her methods and looking for patterns or weaknesses he might exploit. "I'd like to attempt a scenario that's more realistic to what we might face in the field," Jackson continued. "Instead of a one-on-one demonstration, what if I tried to pin you down while you were already on the ground? No techniques, just pressure and position control." It was actually an intelligent challenge that addressed one of the most common criticisms of defensive techniques. Critics often argued that such methods only worked when both fighters started from equal positions, and that someone who was already compromised or caught off guard wouldn't be able to apply them effectively. Commander Mitchell looked to Sarah for her response. "Lieutenant, you're under no obligation to attempt anything beyond the scope of what we originally planned." Sarah considered the request carefully. It would certainly be more challenging than the standing demonstrations she had been performing, and there was a greater risk of injury if something went wrong. However, it also represented an opportunity to demonstrate the full versatility of the techniques she had developed. "I'm willing to attempt it," Sarah said finally. "But I'd like to establish clear safety protocols and make sure everyone understands the increased risks involved." Mitchell quickly outlined the safety guidelines, including immediate submission recognition and spotters positioned around the mat to intervene if necessary. The crowd grew even more attentive, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah positioned herself on the mat in a supine position, lying on her back with Jackson kneeling beside her. The scenario was designed to simulate the worst-case situation where someone had been knocked down or caught off guard, and was facing an opponent with a significant positional advantage. "Whenever you're ready, sir," Sarah said, settling into position and preparing herself mentally for what was about to unfold. Jackson moved quickly to establish what grapplers call the mount position, straddling Sarah's torso and using his weight and leverage to pin her arms to the mat. It was a dominant position that typically left the person on bottom with very few options for escape or counterattack. Jackson executed the technique perfectly, showing his wrestling background and understanding of positional control. For several seconds, it appeared that Jackson might have finally found a scenario where Sarah's techniques would prove ineffective. His weight advantage was substantial, and his positioning prevented her from using many of the leverage-based movements that had been so successful in the previous demonstrations. But Sarah had trained extensively in ground fighting scenarios and had developed specific techniques for escaping from precisely this type of disadvantageous position. She began by controlling Jackson's wrists to prevent him from establishing a more secure pin, then used a subtle hip movement to create the space she needed to begin her escape sequence. What happened next was a masterclass in biomechanical efficiency. Sarah executed a technique called a bridge and roll, using her entire body to create momentum while simultaneously off-balancing Jackson. The movement was so explosive and precise that Jackson found himself completely reversed in position before he could react or counter. Within seconds, Sarah had not only escaped from the bottom position but had actually gained top control and secured a submission hold on Jackson's arm. The entire reversal took less than 5 seconds, transforming what appeared to be a hopeless situation into a decisive victory. The crowd erupted in genuine amazement. What they had just witnessed defied their understanding of how ground fighting was supposed to work. Jackson, despite his size, experience, and positional advantages, had been completely overwhelmed by the speed and precision of Sarah's technique application. Jackson himself looked stunned as he tapped out, and the two fighters separated. "Ma'am, I have never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought I had you completely controlled, and then, suddenly, I was the one in trouble. How is that even possible?" Sarah helped Jackson to his feet and took a moment to explain the principles behind what she had just demonstrated. "The key is understanding that position is only as strong as your ability to maintain it," she said. "When you focus too much on using strength to hold someone down, you often create the very openings that allow them to escape." The explanation sparked immediate interest from multiple members of the crowd, who began asking detailed questions about the mechanics of the techniques they had witnessed. Sarah found herself conducting an impromptu educational session, breaking down the biomechanical principles that made her methods so effective. As the questions continued, it became clear that something significant was happening beyond just the individual demonstrations. The assembled personnel were beginning to understand that they were witnessing a revolutionary approach to personal combat that could potentially transform how they thought about training and tactical preparation. Master Chief Williams, the senior enlisted advisor for the SEAL training program, stepped forward with a request that surprised everyone present. "Lieutenant Shun, what you've demonstrated here today has been remarkable, but I'd like to ask you something that goes beyond individual techniques." Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that his question would be important. "We have personnel here representing different specialties, backgrounds, and levels of experience. Some are seasoned operators, others are newer to special operations. Do you think these techniques could be taught effectively to individuals with varying levels of physical ability and prior training?" It was exactly the kind of question that got to the heart of why Sarah had developed her methods in the first place. Too often, defensive techniques were taught as one-size-fits-all solutions that didn't account for differences in body type, strength, or experience level. "That's actually the primary advantage of leverage-based techniques," Sarah replied. "They're designed to work for anyone who understands the principles, regardless of their physical attributes. The key is learning to use proper positioning and timing rather than trying to overpower an opponent." To demonstrate her point, Sarah asked for volunteers from different sections of the crowd. She specifically requested individuals who represented various body types and experience levels, wanting to show that the techniques weren't limited to people with specific physical characteristics. Petty Officer Davis stepped forward first. A smaller individual who had always struggled with traditional combatives training due to his slight build, Davis had watched the previous demonstrations with particular interest. He had often felt disadvantaged in physical training scenarios and was curious whether these techniques might level the playing field for him. Sarah spent several minutes teaching Davis a basic escape technique, breaking down each component and explaining the underlying principles. When they tested the technique against a larger opponent, Davis was amazed to find that he could successfully apply it despite his size disadvantage. "This changes everything," Davis said with obvious excitement. "I've always felt like I was at a huge disadvantage in physical training. These techniques actually give me options I never knew existed." Similar demonstrations followed with personnel representing different backgrounds and physical characteristics. Each successful application of the techniques reinforced the same fundamental lesson. Proper understanding of leverage and positioning could overcome significant physical disadvantages when applied correctly. The educational component of the demonstration was proving to be just as impactful as the individual matches Sarah had won. Personnel were beginning to understand not just that the techniques worked, but why they worked and how they might be able to learn and apply them in their own training. Commander Mitchell called for attention as the session approached its planned conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that makes our special operations community so effective. Lieutenant Chun has demonstrated techniques that could benefit every person in this room. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause, but Mitchell held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished speaking. However, I understand there are still questions about how these techniques might perform against multiple opponents or in more chaotic scenarios. Lieutenant Chun, would you be willing to attempt one final demonstration that addresses those concerns? Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the suggestion. Fighting multiple opponents simultaneously was exponentially more difficult than the individual demonstrations she had been performing. The techniques she had developed were certainly applicable to such scenarios, but the margin for error was much smaller. What exactly did you have in mind, sir? Sarah asked. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah faced the group of 4 volunteers who had stepped forward for the final demonstration. Unlike the previous one-on-one encounters, this scenario would test her ability to apply her techniques under the most challenging possible circumstances. Multiple attackers meant multiple threats, reduced reaction time, and the constant possibility of being overwhelmed through sheer numbers. The volunteers represented a diverse mix of experience and fighting styles. Rodriguez had asked to participate again, clearly hoping to redeem himself after his earlier defeat. Thompson and Williams had also volunteered, along with Petty Officer Brooks, a military police specialist known for his arrest and control techniques. Together, they represented more than 800 pounds of trained muscle and decades of combined combat experience. Commander Mitchell established the rules for this final demonstration. The attackers would attempt to pin Sarah down using any combination of techniques they chose, while she would defend using her leverage-based methods. The scenario was designed to simulate a realistic situation where someone might face multiple opponents in close quarters. Gentlemen, remember that this is still a training exercise, Mitchell announced. Controlled aggression only, and immediate response to any submission or safety signal. Lieutenant Chun, are you ready to proceed? Sarah nodded. Though internally, she was running through the mental preparations that would be crucial for success against multiple opponents. Fighting several people simultaneously required a completely different mindset than individual combat. The key would be constant movement, preventing anyone from establishing solid control, and using the attacker's numbers against them by creating situations where they interfered with each other. The attackers spread out around her in a loose circle, each taking a position that would allow them to coordinate their approach. Sarah could see them making eye contact with each other, establishing a basic plan for how they would attempt to overwhelm her defenses. Rodriguez moved first, attempting to grab her from the front while Thompson approached from her left side. It was a coordinated attack designed to divide her attention and create opportunities for the other 2 attackers to join the assault. Sarah's response was immediate and fluid. Instead of trying to defend against both attacks simultaneously, she moved toward Thompson while deflecting Rodriguez's grab with a redirecting movement that sent him stumbling past her position. The movement placed Thompson between her and Rodriguez, creating a momentary barrier that prevented the coordinated attack from succeeding. Before Thompson could adjust to her sudden approach, Sarah had secured a grip on his wrist and applied a standing armbar that forced him to bend forward to protect his elbow. The position temporarily removed him as a threat while also using his body as a shield against the other attackers. Williams and Brooks, seeing their colleague's initial attack fail, immediately moved to surround Sarah from different angles. But Sarah was already in motion, using Thompson's compromised position to pivot around him while maintaining control of his arm. The movement kept her mobile while forcing the other attackers to constantly readjust their positions. Rodriguez, having recovered from his initial stumble, attempted to grab Sarah from behind. But she sensed his approach and executed a technique that simultaneously released Thompson while applying a backward throw that sent Rodriguez tumbling across the mat. The throw was executed with such precision that Rodriguez landed hard but safely, immediately removing him from the engagement. The crowd watched in amazement as Sarah flowed from one technique to another, never remaining stationary long enough for the attackers to establish the coordinated control they needed to succeed. Her movements were like watching a dance, with each technique flowing seamlessly into the next while maintaining constant awareness of all threats. Brooks, the military police specialist, tried a different approach. Instead of attempting to grab or control Sarah directly, he focused on cutting off her movement options by positioning himself to limit her escape routes. It was a smart tactical decision that showed his law enforcement background and understanding of controlling suspects in confined spaces. Sarah recognized the strategy immediately and adapted her approach accordingly. Instead of trying to maintain distance, she suddenly moved directly toward Brooks, closing the gap before he could react. The aggressive movement caught him off guard and allowed her to apply a takedown technique that put him on the ground while keeping herself mobile. Thompson, still recovering from the armbar, attempted to rejoin the fight by grabbing Sarah's legs as she dealt with Brooks. But Sarah was ready for the attack and used a sprawl technique to avoid the takedown while simultaneously applying a guillotine choke that forced Thompson to submit almost immediately. Within less than 90 seconds, Sarah had effectively neutralized all four attackers using a combination of throws, joint locks, and chokes. The speed and efficiency with which she had dealt with multiple opponents simultaneously left the entire crowd stunned into silence. The demonstration had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Sarah's own. She had successfully applied her techniques under the most challenging possible circumstances, proving that proper training and technique could overcome even overwhelming odds when applied with precision and intelligence. As the attackers recovered and regrouped, the expressions on their faces ranged from amazement to professional respect. Rodriguez, who had been defeated twice, approached Sarah with obvious admiration. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I came into this thinking size and strength were all that mattered in a fight. You've completely changed my understanding of what's possible with proper technique." Similar sentiments echoed from the other volunteers and throughout the crowd. What had started as skeptical observation had transformed into genuine appreciation for the sophistication and effectiveness of Sarah's methods. Commander Mitchell stepped forward to address the assembled personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today represents a breakthrough in our understanding of personal combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Chun has demonstrated that properly applied technique can overcome significant physical disadvantages, even in scenarios involving multiple opponents." The crowd responded with sustained applause that reflected not just appreciation for Sarah's performance, but excitement about the implications of what they had witnessed. Personnel throughout the audience were already discussing how these techniques might be incorporated into their own training programs and tactical preparations. Master Chief Williams approached Sarah as the crowd began to disperse. "Lieutenant, what you've shown us today is going to revolutionize how we think about close-quarters combat training. We need to discuss how we can make these techniques available to all our personnel." The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most significant changes in military training protocols in decades. Sarah's demonstration had proven that technical skill, properly developed and applied, could provide advantages that traditional strength and conditioning programs simply couldn't match. Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself conducting impromptu teaching sessions with small groups of personnel who wanted to learn the basic principles behind her techniques. The enthusiasm was infectious, with experienced operators showing genuine excitement about learning methods that could enhance their effectiveness regardless of their physical attributes. Word of the demonstration began spreading beyond the immediate participants almost immediately. Personnel who hadn't been present started arriving at the facility, hoping to witness additional demonstrations or learn more about the techniques that had created such a buzz throughout the base. The weeks following Sarah's demonstration at Coronado transformed her from a relatively unknown defensive tactics instructor into one of the most sought-after training specialists in the military community. Requests for her expertise poured in from special operations units around the world, each wanting to understand and implement the techniques that had created such a sensation among the Navy SEALs. The video recordings of her demonstrations, initially restricted to military personnel only, became legendary within the special operations community. Every major training facility wanted copies, and Sarah found herself traveling constantly to conduct workshops and training seminars at bases from Fort Bragg to overseas installations in Europe and Asia. The most significant change, however, was the formal adoption of Sarah's techniques into the official Navy SEAL training curriculum. Commander Mitchell had worked tirelessly with senior leadership to incorporate leverage-based defensive methods into the standard Hell Week training program, making Sarah's techniques a permanent part of how future SEALs would prepare for combat situations. 3 months after the original demonstration, Sarah returned to Coronado to conduct the first official instructor certification course for her methods. The student roster read like a who's who of special operations training specialists, with representatives from every major military unit eager to learn how to teach these revolutionary techniques to their own personnel. Petty Officer Rodriguez had become one of her most dedicated students. The experience of being defeated so quickly and decisively had sparked a genuine passion for understanding the principles behind her methods. He had spent countless hours practicing the techniques and had become skilled enough to serve as an assistant instructor during the certification course. "Lieutenant, I still can't believe how completely wrong I was about what makes someone effective in combat," Rodriguez confided during a break in the training. "I spent years thinking that being bigger and stronger was all that mattered. Your demonstration showed me there's a whole world of possibilities I never knew existed." His transformation reflected a broader change that was occurring throughout the military community. Personnel who had previously relied primarily on physical attributes were discovering that technical skill could provide advantages they had never imagined possible. The shift in mindset was creating a new generation of fighters who valued precision and intelligence as much as strength and aggression. Sarah's influence extended beyond just individual techniques. Her emphasis on leverage-based methods had sparked research into other areas where technical expertise could overcome physical limitations. Engineering teams were studying her biomechanical principles to develop better equipment designs, while medical specialists were incorporating her movement concepts into rehabilitation programs for injured personnel. The international attention surrounding her work led to invitations from allied military forces around the world. Sarah found herself conducting training sessions for British Special Air Service personnel, German Special Forces units, and elite police tactical teams from multiple countries. Each group brought their own perspectives and challenges, helping to refine and improve her methods through practical application. One of the most memorable international workshops took place at a joint training facility in Scotland, where Sarah worked with a mixed group of Special Forces operators from 6 different countries. The cultural and language barriers initially created communication challenges, but the universal effectiveness of her techniques quickly overcame those obstacles. During that workshop, she faced her most challenging test, yet when a group of Russian Spetsnaz operators requested a demonstration similar to what had occurred at Coronado. The Russians were known for their emphasis on physical conditioning and aggressive fighting styles, and they were openly skeptical about whether technical methods could prove effective against their approach to combat. The demonstration that followed rivaled the original Coronado session in terms of drama and impact. Sarah successfully defended against multiple attacks from some of the most physically imposing and experienced fighters she had ever encountered. The Russians' aggressive style actually played into the strengths of her defensive methods, allowing her to use their momentum and commitment against them. The success of that international demonstration cemented Sarah's reputation as something more than just an innovative instructor. She had become a symbol of how intelligence and technique could overcome seemingly insurmountable physical disadvantages, inspiring personnel from diverse military backgrounds to reconsider their own training approaches. Back in the United States, the impact of Sarah's work was being felt throughout the broader military training community. The Army's Special Forces units had officially adopted modified versions of her techniques for their own training programs. Marine Force Recon had developed an entire course module based on her principles. Even traditional military police units were incorporating her methods into their arrest and control procedures. The transformation wasn't limited to active duty personnel. Veterans organizations had begun offering courses based on Sarah's techniques, recognizing their value for individuals who might need effective self-defense methods despite physical limitations or injuries sustained during their military service. The techniques proved particularly valuable for female veterans, and those dealing with mobility issues that made traditional defensive methods impractical. Sarah's work also attracted attention from civilian law enforcement agencies. Police departments dealing with situations where officers faced larger or more aggressive suspects found that her techniques provided options that didn't rely on escalating force. The methods proved especially valuable for female officers and smaller personnel who had previously struggled with physical confrontations. 1 year after the original Coronado demonstration, Sarah received news that would represent the pinnacle of professional recognition for her achievements. The Pentagon had approved the creation of a new specialized training position specifically designed around her expertise. She would become the first director of adaptive combat systems, with responsibility for developing and implementing innovative training methods across all branches of the military. The position would allow her to expand her research and development work while ensuring that her techniques reached the widest possible audience within the military community. It represented not just personal success, but validation of the revolutionary approach to combat training that she had spent years developing. The formal ceremony announcing her new position took place at the same Coronado facility where her legend had begun. Many of the personnel who had witnessed the original demonstration were present, along with senior military leadership from around the world who had come to recognize the significance of her contributions. Commander Mitchell, who had been promoted to captain partly based on his role in recognizing and promoting Sarah's innovations, served as the master of ceremonies. His opening remarks captured the transformation that had occurred since that memorable morning 1 year earlier. When we first invited Lieutenant Chun to demonstrate her techniques, we thought we were conducting a routine training exercise, Mitchell said to the assembled crowd. What we discovered was a new understanding of human potential that has revolutionized how we think about personal combat effectiveness. The ceremony included demonstrations by some of Sarah's most successful students, showing how her techniques had been adapted and refined through practical application. Rodriguez performed a flawless demonstration against multiple opponents, displaying the kind of skill that would have been unimaginable before his exposure to Sarah's methods. As Sarah took the podium to accept her new position, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had started as a simple desire to develop effective defensive techniques for smaller individuals had evolved into a movement that was changing military training around the world. The most important lesson I've learned through this experience, Sarah told the audience, is that human potential is far greater than we typically imagine. When we focus on developing technique and understanding rather than simply trying to become bigger and stronger, we discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, reflecting not just appreciation for her individual achievements, but recognition of the broader impact her work was having on military training philosophy. Personnel throughout the audience understood that they had been part of something historic, both as witnesses to the original demonstration and as participants in the transformation that followed. As the ceremony concluded and Sarah began her new role, the ripple effects of that original demonstration at Coronado continued to spread. Training facilities around the world were implementing programs based on her methods. Research teams were studying the biomechanical principles behind her techniques. Most importantly, thousands of military personnel were discovering that their own potential was far greater than they had ever imagined possible. The legend that began with Sarah handling multiple Navy SEALs in seconds had evolved into something much more significant. A new understanding of what human beings could accomplish when they combined intelligence, technique, and proper training. The story that started in a training facility in San Diego had become a catalyst for changing how people around the world thought about their own capabilities and potential. Years later, military historians would mark that demonstration as a turning point in combat training philosophy, comparing its impact to other revolutionary moments in military innovation. For Sarah, however, the greatest satisfaction came from the countless individuals who had discovered their own hidden potential through the techniques and principles she had developed and shared with the world. By evening, Sarah had conducted additional training sessions with more than 50 personnel representing various specialties within the special operations community. Each session reinforced the same fundamental lessons while also revealing new applications and variations of the basic techniques. The impact extended beyond just the immediate tactical applications. Sarah's demonstration had challenged fundamental assumptions about physical capability that had shaped military training for generations. The idea that technical skill could be more important than raw physical attributes represented a paradigm shift that would influence training programs for years to come. As the day concluded, Sarah reflected on the unexpected impact of what she had originally thought would be a routine training demonstration. The techniques she had developed over years of research and practice had not only proven effective but had captured the imagination of some of the most elite military personnel in the world. The ripple effects of that single day would continue to spread throughout the military community, eventually influencing training programs at facilities around the world. The demonstration had created a new understanding of what was possible when technical skill was properly developed and applied, regardless of physical limitations. What Sarah didn't realize at the time was that video recordings of her demonstration would eventually be studied by military training specialists, martial arts instructors, and law enforcement agencies around the world. The techniques she had demonstrated would be analyzed, adapted, and incorporated into training programs that would benefit thousands of individuals in various fields. The legend that began that day at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado would grow with each retelling, inspiring a new generation of fighters to focus on technical excellence rather than relying solely on physical attributes. Sarah had not just won a series of individual demonstrations. She had started a revolution in how people thought about personal combat effectiveness. As she prepared to leave the base that evening, Sarah understood that her life and career had changed dramatically. What had started as a simple training demonstration had evolved into something much more significant, with implications that would extend far beyond anything she had originally imagined possible. Mitchell gestured toward a group of volunteers who had assembled near the edge of the mat. "We'd like to see how your techniques work when you're facing multiple attackers who aren't necessarily following any rules or taking turns." Sarah looked at the group of volunteers and realized that the stakes of the demonstration had just increased dramatically. Success would prove that her methods were applicable to real-world scenarios where multiple threats were present. Failure, however, would undermine much of what she had accomplished during the previous demonstrations. The room fell completely silent as personnel realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. The individual demonstrations had been impressive, but a successful defense against multiple opponents would elevate Sarah's techniques to legendary status within the special operations community. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded her acceptance of the challenge. She understood that this final demonstration would determine not just her own reputation, but the future credibility of the training methods she had spent years developing. Everything was on the line, and 301 of the Navy's elite personnel were watching to see whether she could deliver one more miracle. Each successive demonstration reinforced the same fundamental lesson: properly applied technique, executed with precision and timing, could overcome significant physical advantages. The speed with which Sarah was defeating experienced opponents was perhaps even more impressive than the techniques themselves, showing that these methods could be applied effectively under pressure and against resistance. As the demonstrations continued, something interesting began happening in the crowd. The initial skepticism was being replaced by genuine curiosity and professional interest. Personnel were asking detailed questions about how the techniques worked, where they could learn them, and how they might be incorporated into existing training programs. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was remarkable. What had started as an attempt to disprove the effectiveness of technical skill was becoming a masterclass in how proper training and technique application could revolutionize personal combat effectiveness. Sarah was not just winning individual matches. She was changing minds about fundamental assumptions that many of the observers had held throughout their entire careers. As the session approached its midpoint, it was clear that something special was happening. The demonstrations were exceeding everyone's expectations and creating a buzz that would soon spread far beyond the confines of the training facility. Word was already beginning to circulate about the incredible techniques being demonstrated and the remarkable skill of the instructor who was applying them with such devastating effectiveness. What she didn't know was that Rodriguez had spent considerable time preparing for this encounter as well. He had watched videos of her techniques, discussed strategies with other personnel, and developed specific plans for how he intended to demonstrate the limitations of her methods. He was confident that his size, strength, and experience would prove decisive. As the demonstration began, neither Sarah nor Rodriguez could anticipate that the next few minutes would create a legend that would be discussed in military training circles for years to come. The techniques Sarah was about to employ, and the speed with which she would apply them, would challenge every assumption about physical confrontations that many of the observers held. The silence in the room was deafening as Mitchell raised his hand to signal the beginning of the demonstration. 300 one of the Navy's elite personnel watched intently, most expecting to see the limits of technique when faced with superior size and strength. Instead, they were about to witness something that would forever change how they thought about the relationship between skill and physical attributes in combat situations. Sarah took a deep breath, centered herself, and prepared to show them exactly what properly applied technique could accomplish against even the most formidable opponents. The stage was set for a demonstration that would become the stuff of military training legend.